Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this interview, I had the opportunity to speak with David Pudwill about conspiracy and propaganda in the medical sphere. David spent a number of years in the FDA and is currently doing medical consulting. I wanted to speak with David for a number of reasons. First of all, his experience makes him a good person to talk to because he's seen both the business and the governmental side of things a little bit. Also, he was an easy mark for me because he's my cousin and I've known him my whole life. And so I knew that having come out of the FDA and no longer being there and maybe having to cover all of his bases, he would be able to speak a little bit freely and might be willing to talk with me. So, and I know he's smart, right? So I was in, when I remember my senior year, I went to calculus, and in my calculus class, on the first day, I look at my syllabus and I'm like, ugh, no way. So I dropped it for consumer math, which was a lot harder than I thought it would be, doing taxes and stuff. But whatever, I dropped calculus. Meanwhile, he was in, when he was in a freshman or a sophomore in high school, he's taking maths that I'd never heard of. He's in like Calc 3 as a freshman or something like that. So he's super smart and knows what he's talking about and has educated opinions. So I thought it would be a good conversation. Because David and I chat quite a bit, I made this one a kind of freewheeling conversation of sorts. We didn't know exactly where we were going to go. I mean, I had told him a little bit about my season on propaganda before, and so we had some discussions, but I didn't have as much of a script as I do with other people where I send them questions and they're able to have notes and think through their responses before we speak. We just kind of went with it. And so you'll probably get a different sort of feel from this interview than you do from a lot of the other interviews. Because it was a little less guided, and David's experience is a little bit different, we didn't actually get to some of the emphases that I discussed in this section on medical propaganda. One of the things that we talked a lot about in regard to medical propaganda is sort of the deification or the religiosity of the medical sphere and the scientific sphere in our culture, as well as some of these ideas of benevolence, where sometimes things can happen, and the medical community or the scientific community will spin it as, well, we're doing these bad things because we love you. We know what we're doing. We seek a greater good. The ends justify the means. We got a little bit of that in this conversation, but it wasn't quite as emphasized. A lot of our focus was a little bit less on propaganda and a little bit more on conspiracy and how structures of conspiracy can form. And so one of the things that we brought up was George Carlin's famous dialogue you can get on YouTube, where he just basically says, hey, look, you don't need a technical or a formal conspiracy when interests converge. And so you get this idea of convergence versus conspiracy. And David talks a lot about that, right? He's not this big conspiracy theorist who sees a conspiracy behind everything, but because of the way that systems are structured, you're going to end up seeing convergence, and you're going to end up seeing these things which later look like conspiracy as people figure out how to manipulate the systems that have formed, but one might call them convergence over conspiracy. And so that gets a little bit into this gray area of definitions. How do you define conspiracy? Do people have to know that they're conspiring for it to be a conspiracy? How much manipulation constitutes conspiracy? All that kind of stuff. Before you listen to the conversation, I do want to highlight 3 things that I think were particularly important to note as you listen. First of all, David talked a bit about this idea of the importance of diversity. Or on the flip side, as we've talked about propaganda throughout the season, the problem of polarization. Polarization is one of the hallmarks of being propagandized, this extreme polarization. And so David talked about the importance of a diversity of voices and how that at this point doesn't seem to happen too much, especially in institutions, large corporations, governmental offices. Right? Things become politicized. There's a particular narrative or ideology that needs to be ascribed to. There are certain agendas and goals that everybody has. And so at some point, you don't really have a diversity of voices who are willing to kind of kick against the goads, who are willing to push back and put their necks on the line. Everybody just kind of goes along with the flow with one voice. And that's really dangerous. It's diversity a lot of times in science and anything that leads to revolutions and breakthroughs and knowledge. When you don't have a diversity of voices, not only do things become stagnant, but you lose the perspective of diversity that allows you to see things that you don't see when everybody's just kind of going with the grain. And so there are dangers to not discovering things, but there are also dangers to when you have one voice and there's dissonance, and you're the cause of that dissonance, that there can be problems for you. The second thing that you can note is we weren't originally planning on talking about the vaccine. It's one of those things, like I said before in some previous episodes, I don't want to really talk too much about the vaccine because that's one that's still fresh for a lot of people and for the COVID vaccine. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on more controversial things that people might have some different opinions about, and it might be too difficult at this point emotionally for individuals to assess those rationally. But I thought that it was important as our discussion progressed. I thought it was important to bring up the vaccine because David was talking about diversity and was talking about polarization, and it did sort of tie into our discussion on the religiosity of science and medicine. Because as David was saying, you've got people who are essentially, they've become religious either way about the COVID vaccine, right? I'm going to vaccinate my infant. I don't know if anybody vaccinated their infant, but that extreme. You have people who are like, I'm going to just vaccinate as soon as I can, get as many boosters as I can. It doesn't matter if my kid has like hardly any risk, and it doesn't matter if this doesn't really protect my family members from having the virus spread to them because my kid can still get it. It doesn't matter. None of that matters because this is going to make me feel safe, and this is going to be my savior to vaccinate my kid. At the same time, you've got this religiosity that seeks a savior in something like freedom, where it's no way am I going to get my vaccine because the government, nobody can be trusted. All of the doctors who are out there, anybody who would say that the vaccine is good is on the government payroll, part of a conspiracy. And you've got people who just can't see any good in the vaccine and can't understand why the vaccine would be pushed and any legitimacy to it. And so you've got just this religiosity, this polarization on all sides, and there's not really a look at the data. There's not really a rational stance. And so we did get into the vaccine, and I think that's a good place to take a look at this idea of polarization, religiosity, this how polarization leads to savior complex on either side. Something's going to be your savior. And that's what propaganda does, right? It instills fear, and it creates these poles that can't think objectively or rationally, and then it ends up providing you with a savior. You got a different savior at each pole, but all propaganda is going to provide you with a savior. And so that leads us to the final thing. If we are polarized and we are very far apart from individuals at the other pole, how do you deal with those people who are essentially enemies? And if you're in the middle and you're getting shot at by both sides because everybody hates you, right? Because propaganda, if you're not with us, you're against us. And so both poles hate anybody in the middle. And David talks a little bit about this. He discusses how do you try to change people's mind? How do you have discussions with people? And he talks about the importance of listening, of course, which is vital. And then he talks about the importance of love, which listening is a form of love a lot of times, like truly listening, not just listening so you can respond and chime in, but truly listening in love because you care about other people and you care about what they think. And I've mentioned him throughout the seasons here, but Daryl Davis is a great example of this, right? You've got people who go out and hate the KKK because the KKK is just, atrocious in their thinking and the things that they've done throughout the years. And so people will be terrible to them, and of course the KKK is terrible to people. But then you've got this black guy, Daryl Davis, who sits down, listens to them, and talks with them, and shows them humanity. And he doesn't change everybody's mind, and he might not even change most people's mind, but because of his love and listening, he has changed the minds of over 200 KKK people, I think it is, at this point. And that's something that we're going to get into at the end of the season when we assess all the things that we've learned and looked at. What do we do with this? And what do we do with the idea of truth? How do we come to know things? And then what do we do with that? How do we propagate love and truth? And the answer is going to be, for if you want kind of a sneak peek, but the Bible's model is discipleship. That's what Jesus did. And I think that even though it's similar to propaganda, right? Depending on how you define propaganda, right? You're just propagating a belief. So discipleship is propagating a belief, but it does so in a different manner. And so we're going to get to that at the end of the season, but I think David gives you a sneak peek at that, where love and listening and conversing with somebody else, that is seeking to propagate truth, but it's seeking to do it in a non-objective manner, because rather than objectifying somebody, non-objectifying manner, rather than objectifying somebody as some end goal ideology to disseminate, like a virus getting inside of them and changing their mind, it views them as another human worthy of love and somebody who you want to love in truth as well. You want them to be able to love in truth. And so discipleship and this polarizing propaganda are very different things. And this, my brief conversation with David kind of alludes to some of what we're going to get to later. One final note before we get to the discussion proper: there are a number of images referenced in the episode, and I always put things that we mention or talk about in episodes, I put them, links to those in the show notes. So definitely go and check out the show notes for links to some of the things that we reference. So without further ado, here is my conversation with David Pudwill.
I'm David Pudwill, and I do medical device consulting for a number of companies. I've worked at FDA. I've worked for a couple different medical device manufacturers, and I've also known Derek for my just about my entire life. So that's some useful background, I think, maybe at a high level.
Yeah, you only want to say things that are going to give you credibility.
But knowing you for a very long time, doesn't that lend a degree of credibility? I don't know. Maybe we're colluding. There's something to be said for, I think, the path of the discussion here. But anyway,
it's true. Yeah. So we've been talking for a while. We talk every couple months, and so while I'm going through this propaganda season, I've been talking to you and bouncing some ideas off of you. And so, of course, when I got to the medical section of propaganda, you were the first person that came to mind to talk about maybe how you see propaganda or conspiracy, or don't see it in the real world. So you shot me a bunch of different ideas, and you are the expert completely here in this episode. So why don't you go ahead and talk about your first impressions when I was talking to you, and what came to mind?
Yeah. So some of the first things that come to mind for me when we're thinking about conspiracy, and we've heard a lot of this language in the last couple of years, in particular, since we've had the pandemic situation with COVID, and there's a lot of things happening around FDA and and other government agencies, and my general views on this is that we've set up a lot of institutions, and those institutions and the way that they've operated have fundamentally eroded public trust in them and how they operate. And so there's a lot of grasping at straws as that happens, and as institutions that you've come to trust and rely on, as you find out the information you're getting from them is not as good as it used to be. Maybe it never was as good as you thought it was. And you start to go down these rabbit holes of questioning everything you've ever known. And that's a very common, thing. I think once you find out one thing is false or some falsehood, happened, it's like, okay, we're in December, right? And I don't teach my, kids a whole lot about Santa Claus. They know about the guy, but they've always, for their entire lives, been the ones who showed up, and teachers complain because they're telling other kids that Santa Claus doesn't exist. It's like this kind of thing. All the other kids are like horrified, and the teachers are like, calming them down. No, 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 don't worry about that, kind of thing. So, I have no problems popping people's, bubbles about, some like shared narratives that we have, culturally, which, sometimes serve a purpose, but aren't necessarily true, right? And then when people find out they're false, they've like all of their belief in everything is shattered. It's like, what else is a lie that you've told me? And so I think that's just a very common human reaction. So I've even had some of that myself, definitely over the course of the last, couple of years. Like, wait, what else is not true that we've been led to believe? But I've worked directly, within, government, institutions, and within that bureaucracy. And, my view is mostly it's a systemic, kind of an issue in terms of how institutions are set up, how they interact. And one of my biggest concerns is the revolving door in the medical space between our government institutions and the industries that those institutions regulate, and also the flow of money that happens between the corporations and FDA and other groups in terms of funding for review of submissions. And a lot of people, can tell you, oh, well, that money is not tied to an outcome. To which I will tell you, but there is a percentage approval that FDA leadership expects, of these products. So any individual product may not have to be approved. They can disapprove that one individual product. But overall, there's an expectation that a certain percentage of products that go through FDA will get approved. And that means that if you are a very large company submitting a very large number of products, at some point you will get some of these products through and approved at a relatively high certainty. So
there's actually a quota?
Yes, there are quotas.
Oh, I would have just thought that, it either passes or it fails, like it's safer.
And it's not that the quota, again, a quota doesn't apply to any individual submission, but there is a sense overall, especially for clinical studies, that there's a certain percentage of those that are going to get approved at each round of review. So that drives certain incentive structures, right? And it's the same thing for overall products, that the incentive structures are set up at FDA where it's very difficult to disapprove a product and it's relatively easy to approve it. Now, that just from an FDA standpoint, I don't mean from a company standpoint. The company does need to do a lot of work to get a product approved or cleared in some cases. So there are different tiers that FDA will review and allow a product onto the market with. So we can call them all marketing authorizations, but they're not all approved. Like not all products are approved. But for those products that are approved by FDA, there are certain legal protections in many instances then for those companies, for those products that have now been reviewed by FDA. And it limits the ability of end users like you and me who may use that product to sue those manufacturers. So there's some limitations on liability. And we've seen that very much so with the vaccines, for instance. There's a lot of legal liability protection that's come into play with that.
Okay,
Um, yes, yeah, go ahead.
s- so basically, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, um, and we talked about this a little bit earlier too, where you said, well, you're not really a big conspiracy theorist, but when things get institutionalized, stuff happens. And I think George Carlin, when he
Yeah.
was having a discussion with Bill Maher before, and
Yeah.
he
It's a big
said, look,
club and you're not in it. But anyway, but you were going to say
yeah, that too. But he said, you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge, or
converge. Yes.
so it's okay. You've got a quota that needs to be filled. You've got a company that has the resources to do the legwork and pay all the financial burden of submitting, and they can submit a lot of things. And
Yes.
so, okay, maybe there's not a conspiracy where people are, in the technical sense, conspiring, but the
Yes.
system is sort of conspiring,
Yes.
unintelligently, just
And
the way that
and
it's
I
set
would
up.
say it's deeper than that too. And this is one thing for a lot of companies to keep in mind is the relationship with FDA can at times be adversarial, but generally in the pre-market space, the FDA reviewer wants to see products approved because it is something that they can point to as having been a part of and having participated in. It's much harder to sell a disapproval as a win. It's much easier to sell, look, I helped this company get their product onto the market and approved. I was part of that team that got this product that now everybody's aware of approved on the market. There's a fundamental incentive for those people within FDA to see an approval. So it's even deeper than just, let's say, quotas, which I would say quotas maybe not quite the right terminology, but these are metrics. They're key process indicators, let's call them KPIs, that FDA tracks. And because that's something that they're tracking, everybody, internally is very much aware of that, and there's a pressure, to some level at least, to see more approvals. Now that can be managed in a positive way, let's say, which is that the reviewers at FDA can reach out to companies and let them know what evidence they need to be able to approve a product, right? And so you're not necessarily lowering the bar, but you are helping the company provide better evidence. But even then, if you have a predetermined level of evidence, or set of information that you're looking for, we know statistically that, okay, let's say you're looking for a 95% confidence in the data set you have. What does that mean? That means, uh, 1 out of 20 times you will get a false positive, right? So if you have companies that are just throwing everything at the wall, occasionally you will get compelling evidence at a 90 or 95% confidence interval, that is just pure happenstance, that a product that doesn't really work on a population level, did happen to provide sufficient evidence that FDA is happy to look at it and put that on the market. And so we try to set those thresholds high enough that that's not a very common occurrence, but it's set at a point where it does happen in real life, and we see this. I mean, FDA looks at, literally thousands of products every year. Maybe more if you're going to count, across various divisions and what they're, going out and inspecting. But in terms of new products that make it onto the market, in medical devices alone, there are about 4,000 products that go through this 510K process at FDA, which is sort of a me too. I'm just like this other device that's already on the market. There are 4,000 of those products every year, and then there are another, let's say, 30 to 50 products that are truly novel that come onto the market every year. And that means even for the very novel products, at the kind of statistical confidence, that levels that we expect, a couple of those products might make it to market and not actually work on a population level.
I don't know if this was. I don't remember if it would have been up your alley there at the FDA. But are you familiar with Elizabeth Holmes?
Yes, very, very familiar
Okay,
with that. I had actually, yeah, my wife was just reminding me of this because I had been talking with them. I hadn't gotten into. I forget if I had done an initial interview with them. I think I'd actually spoken with them and done an initial interview with these people before this all went truly sideways. Because it was a group at the time when I was looking at this before all this came out, it had looked like they just needed good regulatory help and not that there was like malfeasance. It was just it appeared from the outside that they were able to do what they were claiming scientifically, but they lacked, adequate guidance, let's say, and assistance with somebody who was savvy about the regulatory landscape. But it turns out, as far as I can tell, from what's come out in the intervening years, it looks like there's nothing I could have done to really help these people because there were some real fundamental underlying issues about the truthfulness of the information that was being presented.
yeah, I
So
read Tyler Schultz has. I mean, it came up as one of my free reads, and I was like, oh, conspiracy. This will be perfect for the season. So it was a really short read, but it's this guy who is a part of the project, and he started like seeing red flags fairly early or earlier than a lot of other people, and it's
and
kind of his.
you have to be
But
careful about it though too, because like on the flip side, I believe that what they were trying to achieve is possible. And the problem is what we're finding out with a lot of lab developed tests, and FDA is now trying to push Congress to make some changes to how lab developed tests and these sorts of diagnostics that Theranos was working on, how they end up getting reviewed and approved or put on the market. That there would be sort of a fundamental shifting in how that whole landscape is managed. That may very well have been one of the things that was messing Theranos up, was that they were trying to use some of these tests, and these tests are not interchangeable. Some of them perform better than others, and when they started getting these really wonky results, the problem that ended up manifesting was they started obfuscating truth to people that they should have been truthful with. So it's very possible if they'd gone a different route, even though they ran into those challenges of having these discrepancies, if they'd actually pushed into that, it's possible they would have made their way through it. And I think somebody could end up doing effectively what Theranos was trying to do. The problem is, instead of actually trying to pursue truth and trying to get to the bottom of what was causing the discrepancies, they decided to like paper over it. And then, the whole thing went sideways. And that gets into something else, I think, that's similar to what we've talked about, in terms of just how you want to operate in the world. If you are pursuing truth, then you can build something meaningful. Whereas if you start lying even to yourself, I mean, you very quickly bring just all kinds of calamities down upon yourself and the people around you.
yeah, reading that book, it was interesting because there are a number of different ways that you can lie or obfuscate truth. So some of them, I took a statistics class, terrible at it, but I
Lying with
did.
statistics.
Oh, I appreciated all the various ways that you could just manipulate things. It's like, well, I can just change the test and it'll give me, a different outcome. And it's kind of cool what you can do, but it also gave me a lot less faith in a lot of these statistics and tests and things. So with Theranos, they've got I forget exactly how it worked, but he talked about how, you know, let's say you need 95% in order
Yeah.
to move forward. It's like, well, they might have been at like 60%, but they were if they increased a little bit, well, they were 95% better than what they were before, or something like that. I forget exactly what they did, but they would change the numbers. So you have people who are purposefully changing numbers, but then you also have, like, he talked about the just how gregarious Elizabeth Holmes was, how just outgoing and like how confident she was, and like he'd look around and be like, well, everybody else like believes it, and they must just see things that I don't. How easy it is to put your head down, and it's not really a conspiracy when you've got people who really believe this stuff to a certain extent. A conspiracy, the way that we call things conspiracy, but it's you've got a lot of people going along with things that are really shady, and they just don't see it.
So I wanna bring up an image that I love. It's this
Yeah,
interesting image, and we can drop it into something later. Data, information, knowledge,
yeah,
insight, conspiracy theory. And and again, my view is when you connect those dots in that sort of final, sort of picture where it's a flying unicorn. Okay, it's a
hmm
pink flying unicorn. It's conspiracy theory. And you sit here and you go, well, it's only a conspiracy theory if your intuition is wrong. If
hmm
putting all these dots together into that shape ends up being false, then sure, it's conspiracy. But sometimes your intuition is leading you in correct directions about how some of these various bits and pieces are connected. The thing we need to be careful about is what conclusions we draw from that, and that's what I'd say about FDA, in general, and our government agencies, and the way that we navigate, health information, and medical products and other products coming onto the market. And even in situations like Theranos, where they were, um, they were taking actions that were not in the best interests of their customers, of patients, of the rest of us, and even of future people who might solve the problem that they said they wanted to solve. So they've actually made it harder because of what they did for anyone else to come along and try to solve that same problem, because you now get painted with the same brush that Theranos got painted with, as okay, well, that's a really nice story, but the last time anybody did this, it was a bunch of lies. Um, and it's just a shame.
you know, I remember a while ago studying apologetics and you know the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And so this one cold case detective out there in LA, he actually he wrote a book and he talked about how uh, one of the things that is difficult to do when you have conspiracies is to have a lot of people involved, because when
Ah,
you have a lot of
yes.
people involved, you can't have conspiracies because they, you know, they'll squeal, they'll change the stories, they'll lie, all that stuff. And so as I've been studying conspiracies, I found that that's not true. Like it's not completely true. And so there are two other factors that play in, and you identified one when we were first starting. So the two other things that I think there are. So let's say you've got a lot of people, right, involved. Um, Nobody's going to squeal. Like it is not in their interest to squeal unless there's pressure on them,
Yes.
right? So if you're the president of the United States, you can pretty much do whatever you want, and somebody's going to cover it up for you. Or if you do uh, get get caught, like you're probably not really going to have a lot of ramifications on you. So there's little pressure compared to somebody else. Um, but then there's a third one, which is
That
ideology.
cuts both ways though too. Because then all of a sudden there's a lot of upside to revealing that, because you can become the famous whistleblower, like who took down an administration. This was the whole thing with what these journalists with the Nixon administration, right? So there is some incentive there, maybe not for the people involved, to share the information, but for other people to reveal it. So you do get some interesting counterbalance there in some cases.
Yeah, I think a lot of times the people in positions are egotistical, and so Hitler. I mean, if you're killing, massacring millions of people, you've got to know that there's going to be a significant consequence if you fail. But he's like, well, I'm in charge. I've got the power. I'm not going to fail. So I think you see the
Well, and
same
it's
thing in
also
this.
interesting because they, in a lot of the recordings, because they have a lot of like table discussions and things, and there's a lot of hinting around the edges about this. And I haven't gone and listened to all of them, but my understanding is they tend. I don't know that they ever came out in some of these sort of settings and said any of this explicitly. And so it's very interesting how some of these things happen where um, they don't get discussed openly. Everybody knows what's going on, but there are a number of settings in which it still doesn't get brought up. And that's the kind of thing you do see happening. I would say, in some contexts with, uh, review of various medical devices and drugs and these kinds of things at FDA, where, okay, here's how the system works, and people are just going about doing their various pieces of the puzzle there, but nobody's going and revisiting, is this the right approach? Nobody's taught, like, there are all kinds of things that aren't talked about, and you could either say, well, so in the case of, let's say, Hitler, though I always hate going to Nazis, because it's sort of like the edge case, right? But it's like, well, they're not talking about it, which means like something is going on because nobody's talking about it. Sometimes they're not talking about it because they don't, either there's not something going on, or there's not a conspiracy in the way that I would say, we had with, let's say, what was happening in Germany in World War II. You had, a very clear set of malfeasance, operations, going on. Whereas a lot of our institutional challenges, a lot of people may not be saying some of the quiet parts out loud, which is concerning. So whenever there are, things that are known sort of more generally, but nobody talks about it, that's always a concern. But as far as I'm aware, being pretty deep on, on the, having been pretty deep on the industry side and on the FDA side, the challenge in terms of our institutions is that most people believe that the system is operating, as intended, or that it's operating appropriately. But I would argue that operating as intended doesn't mean that it's operating in the best interests or as well as it could, to actually fulfill its stated purposes. So if we were designing a system that was focused on advancing the public health, then that system would do more to bring in new entrants. That system would do less to crush new ideas and advances, which can help people. And there's much more of a focus, and it's just sort of a default focus on preventing harm as opposed to accelerating advancements that can be positive. And so there's this very conservative bent to bureaucracies as they grow and to people who are in charge. I mean, just take a look at COVID policies. What's the primary driver? You had some states that took different actions, but in a large state, you will get blamed for anything that goes wrong. And the big thing you can see that could go wrong is that a bunch of people could die in a pandemic. And so if you're overly draconian, most people will end up forgiving you, even if you were wrong. If you aren't draconian enough, you will be seen as, just totally inept and incapable, regardless of why you were, less heavy handed, in terms of your approach. And we've seen that, work out, where the only reason that people who were less draconian, in certain states, the only reason they've gotten, uh, positive press, let's say in Florida, for Ron DeSantis, is because he ended up being right, not because the actions he took were, more in alignment with, let's say, American values of, liberty and, freedom. If a bunch of people had died, he would be a goat. Nobody would have any respect for him. It's only because he was right that he was able to get away with, holding on to, let's say, these kinds of, values, which is sort of a scary thing, for me, being someone who, wants to see those values of individual autonomy and liberty, free association. I want to see those things advanced. But I think the only reason the public tolerates, that is when it works. And if people start dying, the public will very quickly turn on you and expect very, very draconian measures. And they're willing to tolerate very draconian measures. I mean, the public has been willing to tolerate things that I never would have imagined you could get away with doing, in this country. And you've seen it, in a couple different, sort of cultural contexts. But I don't want to derail us too far into that direction.
Right. Um, yeah, going back to so I think you identified how a system can just work out with people just kind of complying and kind of doing status quo assessments and thinking, well, everything's working. The third things, right? So if you have a lot of people involved in conspiracies, but also if there's not a lot of pressure, the third thing is the one that I thought identified at the beginning, and hope you can talk a little bit more about. But if you have people who have a very strong ideology, very zealous about something or believe something very strongly, then even if there's a lot of pressure and even if there are several people involved in the conspiracy, that ideology can unite them and actually, solidify them in their position in spite of pressure and everything. Yeah. So you were talking a little bit. I don't know that you would have called all the people in government and business and the scientific community zealous for an ideology, but you did talk about a lack of diversity. Yes. So there is kind of one preeminent ideology. Could you talk about that?
There's a monolithic culture, I think, that's emerging out of that, and we've seen, and some other people have talked about this, where a lot of the drug companies, for instance, they will bow to just about anything that FDA asks of them or is looking for, because to some extent it's in their best interest for survival as an organization to just do whatever FDA is asking of them. And I see this leading to, in many cases, some fundamentally unscientific approaches to the way that we manage risk, and the way that we advance public health. And so one clear example in my mind is around something called biocompatibility testing. And some experts could very well disagree with me, but I've looked at literally hundreds of medical device submissions. So I'm talking specifically about medical devices here, and I've heard of situations where the biocompatibility testing results required a change in materials. I've heard that this has happened. I've personally never seen it. So the only thing I've ever seen happen is that more tests are run, and those additional tests demonstrate that the materials are fine. So if over the course of hundreds and hundreds of devices, we have a less than 1% likelihood that a particular test is going to find anything meaningful, probably we should be looking at other metrics and other approaches to find out what that thing is that we should be controlling for, as opposed to slaughtering lots of animals, doing lots of expensive testing for very little, if any, benefit in most cases. and you actually have a delay in time. So all of this testing takes a certain amount of time, and that means that these innovations take longer to get to market. They take longer to get a first sale. It takes longer to get into a patient to see if it works, and that means that for most of those products that are perfectly safe and they get demonstrated to be safe by just conducting more testing that takes more time, um, those products end up not getting to market as quickly, and then you're not able to see whether it works or doesn't work, and sort of fail fast, which is kind of the Silicon Valley approach to more software kinds of products. And the concern within the medical community and at FDA is, well, we're really worried that bad things will happen, right? So it's this hyper focus on the negative outcome as opposed to being aware that not seeing the positive outcomes is also a type of a harm that you are inflicting as a system. And so we're spending a large amount of time and energy on solutions that don't work, that we don't know don't work until much later in the process after we spent lots and lots of money developing them and doing all of this testing. And there are probably some slightly different approaches to make sure that we're adequately controlling for those risks, while accelerating the overall process so that you can get a solution into a subject. Because even if it's safe, let's say that there's a product which is safe from a material standpoint, right? So if you put it inside your body, it's not going to cause some really scary side effect, right? Even then, if it doesn't provide if there's no benefit, then no level of risk is tolerable, right? So if it doesn't help you, it doesn't matter that it's safe, because we shouldn't bother to spend the time and energy and take the risks of a surgical procedure to put it inside of you. And we didn't find that out until years down the line after we'd done all of this preclinical work. And so a lot of that work is something that we're doing simply because we've always done it. And there's some initiatives to try to get away from certain types of animal testing and do other tests. But I would say, my view in the current landscape that we have, there should be some alternate approaches to how we manage safety. So if you use these particular materials that are manufactured using these specific approaches, using these specific molds and manufacturing aids, then we don't have any questions for you. So you like put this into a totally different bucket. But that's not what we do right now. And that would significantly help advance innovation and help advance the public health. But nobody's talking about those kinds of things. Everybody's just very fixated in the ruts that we've already made in the road, and nobody's looking for alternate solutions to address this on a more systemic level. And the issue we run into here is no individual company will be served by trying to rock the boat, right? But the overall industry is harmed because we've just locked ourselves into this particular approach, and everybody takes longer. There's another interesting diagram, about strings and springs and traffic conditions. So this idea that you can have a fastest route if it's just one car or a small number of cars on a small road. But what ends up happening is you get to an equilibrium where everybody's taking longer to get to their destination than if everybody just used an optimal route. So, and there's no way to optimize the system to speed it up once it's already in place, because everybody has their individual incentive, which drives the overall system to be less efficient. And that's what I see happening within medical device review and drug review, and just in terms of how FDA operates. So you have that side of things where you have this inefficiency, but then on the flip side, you have this very large barrier to entry for new people coming in, and it's almost inefficient by design because it will kill new companies coming in. So whether that's what the system intended or it's just a happy accident for big players, there's no real incentive for the big players today, for the billion and larger valued companies to change the system, because currently it works in their favor to prevent competition from coming and eating their lunch.
Yeah, no, I think that describes conspiracies. What I'm finding most conspiracies to end up being is they're happy accidents, but with some of them, at some point, people recognize the accident that happened and start to take advantage of it. And so it's not like this, decades in the making, people conspiring to create this elaborate system. It's just, interests converge, and now you have what you have, and people know how to manipulate the system. So if you're a big company, it's advantageous to you because you've got your team of lawyers and you've got all your money and you know the system and you can flood the system with your stuff and you can prevent competition from coming in. Yeah, I wouldn't want it to change.
And it's the same thing with standards development. It's sort of an interesting, maybe there's a broader application for this. So whenever you're standardizing an approach to how you go about something, there's a baseline, or there should be a baseline assumption, if you're ever trying to standardize something, that it's worth standardizing because you already know everything there is to know in a space, so you can optimize it. But what we find, so the International Standards Organization develops a lot of standards. FDA participates in helping to write those standards. Those standards are mandated in much of the rest of the world. In the US, they typically, let's say in terms of FDA, are quote unquote, let's call them voluntary, though, it's strongly suggested that you comply, right, with these standards. And what you end up finding out is that these very large organizations spend energy and resources staffing those standard writing committees, right, with people who are aligned with their interests, and either on purpose or as a happy accident end up codifying standards which are to their benefit and not to the benefit of their competition. I've seen this directly happen when I was working in industry, where one of the competitors ended up writing their own version of a connector that they'd already implemented in their devices. They made it mandatory. So we had to change all of our devices to use that connector that was their proprietary connector of the competition. So we had to spend all this time and money and resource. And maybe it's just because, hey, this is a good idea, everybody should use this, right? But the cynic in me says, that there was a little bit more to it, than that, especially when it became the expected standard that FDA and the rest of the world were pointing to as what you should be doing in this space. And any number of arguments you have that may or may not be valid just fall on deaf ears at that point, because everybody's decided, and there's a lot of energy and momentum behind staying the course once you've decided to do something. And you just can't get anybody to change their minds once it's been codified, or it's very, very difficult for anybody to change their minds. And so this is the other way that that can work. And the little aside there, I would say, which is a little bit shocking, is that FDA, a government agency, now effectively directs people to go to an international standards organization to go purchase copies of those standards so that they can apply them to their products. But for all intents and purposes, it's required by FDA. Now they're going to tell you there are alternatives, but that's going to cost you way more time and money than just giving these guys a couple bucks to implement their approach. And you could say that benefits small companies, maybe, but really it's a very strange thing that you've got a government agency directing people towards paying for standards from a private, or at least a non, U.S., government, entity, you're now, instead of getting, the input for free, which FDA does, give you in their guidance documents generally, you're now having to pay some third party, to do what the government wants you to do. It's a very interesting, twisted, situation from my perspective.
Okay, so there was a lot there, but I want to.
Yes, and we haven't even gotten into where I want to get to, which is the revolving door. But that's
okay.
That's later on. But
So
continue.
yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, and if you don't want to get into it at all, I know that we want to avoid vaccines a bit, but there's one thing that you said, and you can choose to answer it or not. But you're talking about how you think that things should be data driven, and that the system as it's set up does not do that. In
No.
regard to, but you also said that you want to get things out to help people, as opposed to kind of being too hard on them on the front end. So it seems like with the vaccines, there are a lot of people complaining that we don't know what they are and what damage they could do. And in the one sense, okay, that's true.
There's some of that which is hyperbole, but continue. I think we've got some good data on both what's in them and also what they can do. Though I can appreciate the nuances of that concern. But most of the people shouting that are disingenuous actors.
Right.
So, but continue.
Yeah, so you've got this vaccine that's like, okay, well, we really don't know what it's going to do, but you've also got this virus that could potentially be bad. We didn't know, right? You don't know. You have to take your best guess, and it could have been bad. And the only reason people aren't being flayed right now, who took the freedom route, is because it ended up working out
because
in their
it
favor.
Worked.
The 2-point conversion was good. But at the same time,
you would have been, otherwise, let's lock them up and throw away the key, man.
But when we were talking, you did have reservations in the push for this being done on youth and certain demographics, because you said,
and especially pregnant women. I mean, that's the thing. I have still not seen good data, and I still see communications people from FDA pushing, that everybody should go get themselves vaccinated and boosted. And getting vaccinated is not the same as getting boosted. And this is the thing, like nuanced medical people, can tell you about the accumulated risk that is inherent in getting additional booster shots. And that somewhat depends on whether you've been exposed to the virus as well. And so, the individual risk profiles are going to vary. So there's a lot of disingenuity, if that's a word, in how a lot of this is communicated, and there's a lack of nuance projected. And the communication tends to be, go out and get yourself fully vaccinated. Well, one, that's a moving target. Two, we also know that if you have natural immunity, it's actually it's once you have natural immunity, it's better. Before you have natural immunity, you might be in a population that would be better served having some protection from vaccinations, but that protection wears off over time. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. You almost want, and I'm not advocating for this, but like it almost sounded like you want to go get yourself, vaccinated to blunt the effect of the virus, and then go put yourself in a position where you will get COVID, so you can have some of the like longer term, benefits of immunity. But at the same time, both the vaccination and COVID itself have certain like negative health, effects. And anybody who's going to tell you otherwise, that, vaccines are perfectly safe and there's no side effects, they're lying. But anybody who tells you that vaccines are the most dangerous thing, even these vaccines, which aren't really vaccines as we normally think of vaccination, because it only confers a limited protective benefit, right? So it really depends on the individual circumstance. And this is where my view is, you should have access to treatments, right? So I'm in favor of in enhancing access, right? Without necessarily telling everybody that they ought to go do this, especially young people. Unless you have a 5-year-old or a child who is at some really enhanced risk, I don't know why we are pushing vaccinations in those age ranges based on data which is not very good. I mean, the data didn't meet, at least initially when we started rolling a lot of this out into children. The data did not demonstrate just sort of the basic level of what I would have expected that data to show for us to broadly expand it and recommend it in everybody. Now, it's one thing to say it's available. And so if you're high risk, you should talk with your doctor and think about going and getting it. And so we have this like lack of nuance in how we have these discussions. It's kind of an all or nothing. It's like, either all of the children should go get vaccinated, or we don't have an approval and no one can get vaccinated. It's like, that isn't it's somewhat anti-scientific, and it's become very tribal because everybody wants a counter position. But reality is a lot more nuanced, where you say, no, I actually want there to be available treatments, recognizing that maybe we don't have really robust data yet, but we have enough data maybe that certain populations should consider it at a higher level of adoption than the general public, or at least than children generally. And I'm also I look, it's a family decision, for a lot of these things. But if we're going to vaccinate children to protect vulnerable adults, I generally see that dimly as well. There might be instances where it makes sense, but this is sort of where we've gotten to in the discourse, is that we are vaccinating children to either protect actually vulnerable adults, or to protect adults who feel vulnerable. So a lot of adults want to go get their child vaccinated because it's going to make them feel better about either their child's safety or their safety or the safety of the community, when the evidence does not necessarily support that. And so we get a lot of people making fundamentally unscientific decisions about their medical care. And it's sort of shocking that we've gotten to this point where, we have such a tribal, approach to medicine. And we see this especially at our institutions. I would say historically, FDA, has had a political bent, but it has been scientific in its approaches and its decisions. For all that I don't always agree with what FDA may do, they've tried to be at least scientific in the decisions that they made. Even if they are more aligned politically with one side versus the other. What we saw in the pandemic is the CDC and the NIH, I would say, and other health agencies ended up becoming much more partisan players. And we've seen FDA to start following suit, where they are starting to make decisions that are much more tribal and much less scientific. And that's just bad for overall public trust in the institution. And I get why some of these decisions are made, but it's disheartening to see that tribalism is winning out over the scientific method and approach.
All right, last question, then I'll let you get to your revolving door.
Yeah.
So let's say you're talking about whether it's the COVID vaccine or whether it's vaccines and autism and other sorts of things. You get people who are tribal, on all of those things. And maybe you would agree with tribalism when it comes to the vaccine and autism link, because that seems like something that's a little bit more clear. But
okay.
How would you let's say
you're
talking.
And again, there's a difference between this being, a broad population effect, and this potentially being an individual, adverse event. I mean, we both have an aunt who, potentially suffered vaccine side effects from, I believe it was the polio vaccine.
Right.
And, so I don't know if that actually happened or not, but there's at least a reason to suspect it and to potentially explore that. And so it's interesting when, people who are very aware of that situation, um, are blind to, the potential for vaccine side effects in a novel vaccine, much less, one from years ago. And it's interesting too when we look at the data. So I'll back up a little bit and then sort of frame most of this with the statement that the issue we're running into around COVID specifically is that we were not scientific in our approach. So we didn't run randomized control trials. We don't know. The data doesn't exist anymore, and we've confounded the data set, so we can't even run the trials today to figure out what we don't know, because we've totally confounded the data set with the approaches that we took that were fundamentally unscientific. So rather than running studies to see which intervention in a randomized control manner actually are, better or worse, what the safety effects are, we didn't require that. We just did a population level study without a control group. And that is just it's appalling from a scientific standpoint. So we just don't have good data now, and you can basically say anything you want, and nobody can prove you wrong around certain sort of positions about COVID and vaccinations, et cetera, because the data is just not good because we didn't bother to collect it. So I'm not going to take a one side or the other, except to say we were unscientific in our approach, and I don't think there's any question about that. And that I hold against the regulatory agencies. The regulatory agencies should have been more scientific in their approach and less driven by fear of what was happening, because then we would have actually had information to drive future decision making. But instead, we had years of very little, if any, good information, followed by population level interventions, again without good information. And so it's like we have not learned from our mistakes. And most of the people who were in charge of those agencies and making those decisions are not the kind of people we need running scientific agencies. Like that's like fundamental number one. You want people running scientific agencies who are scientifically minded and are actually going to take the steps needed so that we can have the information to make good decisions in the future.
And you don't want politicians and bureaucrats running scientific agencies?
Generally not.
Okay.
And yeah, and that is very much what what it's gotten to. And this is back to, again, this sort of tribalism that we have at the moment, which is agencies that are coming out and making statements that are not driven by science. They're not driven by scientific evidence. They're driven by a particular tribal opinion and perspective. Yeah, and it could have gone the other way. Like
so how do you deal with that in conversation? You have people who they get their 5-year-old vaccinated when they're completely healthy. They're not around anybody uh, who's susceptible.
they
And
probably already had
and
some level of natural immunity at that point. I mean, the
well, but
number
at the
of
same time,
school-age children who had it based on titers. I mean, when we go and look at who's had it and been exposed, just about everybody at this point, has already been, exposed, and most of those that are children were exposed naturally and developed some kind of natural immunity. So, and I'll continue with this other point. The problem with not having data is that, so there's some population level information that's come out about the overall let's say, excess deaths, risk of mortality, right, in various populations. So those who weren't vaccinated, those who got in the U.S. and in other countries it'll vary, but in the U.S. the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, which is more of a traditional vaccine, and then the mRNA vaccines. And what we've seen is that the risk of dying in the Johnson and Johnson vaccinated population is less than in the unvaccinated group, and the risk of dying in the mRNA vaccinated group overall is higher. But the problem is you can't just even take that at face value, because who would have fallen into each of these groups is different. And so their basic level of risk on a population within these cohorts that have self-selected, it may not be that the mRNA vaccine is any more dangerous than the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. It may just be more vulnerable. More vulnerable people were more likely to get that vaccination. We don't even know at this point. It's really tough to parse the data, looking back. And smarter people than I are exploring this and chasing it and trying to make heads or tails of a lot of this excess death data. But I just point to it to say we fundamentally don't know the things we ought to know. If we had approached this much more scientifically from the beginning, we would already have the answers. People wouldn't have to go try to do some, obtuse statistical analyses to try to figure out, what's the better approach? What should have we done? On top of which is, even if that data does come out, I'm fairly convinced, based on how people have operated, that people aren't going to change their minds about what decision they made. Most people are going to double down that what I did was the right thing, and everybody else are a bunch of morons for not doing exactly what I did. And my view is what you should do in an individual circumstance is going to vary. And I probably can't tell you one way or the other what you should do. Though, I have a framework for how I would deal with that in different cases. And it's mostly based on sort of the risk benefit and trying to overall reduce the risk that you're exposing yourself to. And there's certain circumstances where, getting the vaccinations is probably a higher risk, especially if you're getting boosted. Like we know that for certain young men, the more boosters you get, the higher the likelihood is that you're getting certain sort of, heart related issues. And so, it's going to be very nuanced and depend on the particular, situation. And then I see, blatant lies come out, about the data that we know. There were, I believe it was animal studies, but, we saw in certain animal studies that the spike proteins accumulated in ovaries, which means that there are certain risks for women that are probably higher than men, because we didn't see a similar, kind of, effect for testicles, for testes, for instance. So, there's just and whenever people are fact checking these statements, there's like an obfuscation. Like, this is the thing I've noticed looking at news and looking at fact checking. They have a side that they want to be on, and then they fact check the argument they don't like and find the narrow way in which it's either true or false to fit their narrative, as opposed to talk about how it's true and false, narrative aside. And it's the thing that drives me nuts about just about everybody involved has a side they're trying to tip the scale towards. And maybe that's always been true, but
Yeah, so that's one thing that comes up probably the most out of all of the things that we discuss in propaganda is polarization. That's kind of how it thrives, in the sense that it creates an us versus them. It creates an enemy over there, and then it supplies the savior. And I think that's you talking about how, I mean, it really is religious for both sides. If I see a lot of people in the more conservative groups that I run in. They're posting news articles all the time, like, spike in stroke deaths in young people and all kinds of stuff, and they're like, see,
or
we
this
say,
died suddenly documentary that's
yeah,
going around. I don't know if you've seen this, but anyway.
yeah, and so they're like, well, see, we did the right thing, And it's like, well, maybe it was the right thing for you, right? Maybe it was, but it might not
But
have
there's
been
no
that.
way, even if it is,
Yeah.
there's no way you could have known that when you made the
Yeah.
decision. Like
Yeah.
it's like my intuition, this again, the flying unicorn,
Yeah.
hopefully you can show it somewhere.
Mhm.
This flying unicorn is true, is real. It's like, but when you saw it first, there was no way for you, there was no way
Yeah.
for you to know that that was true.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't
But
know.
then vice versa, you get the people who are, they would immunize their infant, their newborn, if they could, because that vaccine is their savior. And it's like you can't really have rational discussion where you say, well, some people should and some people shouldn't. It's like, how do you bridge that gap between that tribalism? Because, like you said, I completely agree with you. If data would come out, whichever way that data would go, the group that it disproved would completely not, and it might not even disprove a group. It might even just say, hey, there's a right and a wrong. Some people should, some people shouldn't. Like, nobody would ever buy into that. So how do you bridge that in conversation?
It's I try, you can bridge that in conversation. Usually there's some basic rhetorical tools you can use if you know somebody. You can come alongside them and you can sort of walk in the same direction that they're walking in about certain things that you can agree with. So the biggest thing, if you're trying to talk with people, and based on this conversation, and just your audience is probably pretty aware that I just can ramble on and on and on. Like, that's not what you do if you're trying to change somebody's opinion. The way to change somebody's mind is actually to listen, to hear what they have to say, find a point of agreement that you can chime in on and agree with them on something. It lowers somebody's guard. So it opens the possibility for them to receive something from you. Because otherwise, if you're guarded and I've got my shield up and I'm just looking over it at you, there's no way anything you tell me is going to penetrate those defenses, or it's very unlikely that anything you say will penetrate those defenses. Whereas if we're on the same side about something, if we see something in the same way, all of a sudden I can lower that guard, at least for some area of our conversation. And it gives an opening potentially for you to drop some truth, into a situation if you do it in a kind and loving way. And that's where most of us get that wrong. It's like you get somebody to drop their guard, you agree with them, and then you like stab them with truth. It's like, there, take that. We disagree on something fundamental, and now I've stabbed you with it. Like that. That is not helpful to change somebody's opinion, or to take you seriously or lower their guard in the future with you. So so that's the basic thing, is just trying to treat other people in a kind and loving way, and find ways, in conversation where you can agree with somebody and you can find a point of alignment, and then you can push back on some of those things gently where there might be a misalignment, and they might settle into a slightly different place. It's a long and slow dance, I would say. You're not going to get them to your position, even if you're right. And I think most of us should actually have a little bit more humility in recognizing that there are things we're not even aware of that we're wrong about. So that would be my like first, call out, is find a place of agreement. That might be a more likely place that you're right, is if there's a point of agreement with someone else. But then be open to those areas that you might be wrong about. And that's actually where it can be really powerful, is if somebody who you think is wrong about some area actually tells you something that challenges your perspective on reality enough that you shift your position. Like, that can be really powerful when, you find a point of alignment, you even change, your position, because you think they have a good point about how something should be, addressed. Maybe it's just a nuance about your, position, but being willing and open to that, I think, is helpful. And then on a population level, let's say at least on a national level here within the States, the way forward is that we need to be doing things within our institutions that restore trust. And that requires our institutions to stop being political actors. and stop being used as political weapons. We fundamentally need scientifically minded and oriented institutions, and that's something that's going to take a long time to rebuild, and that's something that I'm working on.
Right. Good answer. Love. Okay. I'll let you get to the revolving door now.
So I'm actually in some ways, represented in this, right? So I had been at FDA for a number of years. Before I was at FDA, I was at a medical device company. I was in a lower level position, and then I, had some hands-on experience with devices, and ended up going and working at FDA again at a relatively low level, position, doing reviews of, medical device, submissions. You know, Ended up in middle management when I was at FDA. Ended up in some more senior management at a company when I left FDA. They had a specific challenge that they needed some help with navigating what FDA needed for some submissions, and most of what I did at that company was actually helping them go get the testing that they needed to present to FDA, so FDA would be satisfied with what they saw, much like what we were talking about, earlier on. And you know, and then at that point, I ended up going into consulting. I've helped, some small startups, some medium-sized companies navigate FDA bureaucracy and regulations, and help them prepare for FDA to show up so that they can, do a better job of giving FDA what they need to get a positive result. And there are a lot of people like me who've served in government and now are more in the private and consulting space. The real challenge, though, this is it's a situation, though, which I think can cause a lot of consternation, among people, that you get this movement of people from industry to FDA and then from FDA to industry. It's mostly a big issue at the very senior levels within FDA and senior levels at very large multinational companies, and it's most suspicious when you have somebody who's either come from industry, gone to FDA, and then goes back to the same company, or you get somebody who's been at FDA in a senior, sort of capacity, and then they are involved in making a favorable decision for some company, who shortly thereafter, ends up hiring them into some senior role, or as a consultant, paying them, very high fees to advise them. And some of that is just how the system is set up, and there are certain guardrails against that. I can link an article, that I wrote about exactly this recently, just about a week ago. I don't know when this will get published, but I wrote it before we spoke, and we can post a link to it for people to check out if they want. But fundamentally, there's a real issue here in terms of public trust when it comes to this revolving door, which I've been through, right? So I've gone from industry to FDA and FDA to industry, and there's something we really need to do about that revolving door, and some of it's making people aware of what guardrails there are against this, but it's also important to to ensure that there's not this situation where we get a monoculture developing, because you get this revolving door of people. So whenever people spend a large amount of time together, you start to build a specific culture. And we talked about this a little bit with the medical companies or drug companies, where they're very incentivized to do exactly what FDA is asking them to do. And some of that can even be driven, by the fact that some very senior FDA people may now be at that company, and there's now this alignment in terms of vision and purpose that knits these companies and FDA together in terms of what direction is being forged, and I think that can be, that can present certain dangers because we're likely to miss things. We're likely to just settle in on status quo or settle in on a particular tribal way of seeing things because FDA and the drug companies tend to be fairly aligned on certain perspectives. You wouldn't be at FDA reviewing drugs. You wouldn't be at a company developing drugs unless you shared certain basic worldviews, right? Just to begin with. And then that can get further exacerbated by this revolving door and people passing back and forth. And you get, these well-worn tracks that I talked about in terms of, this is the way we're doing it. This is the way we've done it. This is how we've been successful. And there's a real inherent trap there in getting to where we need to be and making sure that we can restore public trust. Because the public is not going to be very trustful, about a system which has got this revolving door between industry and FDA, and where there's a perception, at least, that FDA is allowing all kinds of things onto the market, which, for the public, may in some cases be hazardous, and that's back to this idea that the incentives politically and for agencies is to avoid harm, not to advance innovation, which is going to bring some benefits. It's the harms that are easily calculated, right? Those that happen for a product that was approved by FDA, that you can point to very easily and say, look at the harm that was caused that FDA didn't stop. But it's very hard to be able to characterize and to quantify those harms that are caused because FDA is not moving fast enough to put other innovations on the market that would have done a lot of good, potentially even been life-saving for certain people who didn't have access to them. I mean, one really good example here in the drug space is HIV drugs, and there was a public outcry about that. But basically FDA doesn't tend to move on in some of those kinds of ways unless there is a public outcry and a demonstration right outside their front doors.
Can you be a little bit more specific on that delay?
Yeah, so
I'm not familiar.
So this was in Rockville, Maryland. There were some demonstrations that happened. I've got a picture of that too somewhere. 1988 AIDS protest at the FDA. October 11th, 1988. AIDS activists occupied the Food and Drug Administration headquarters in Rockville, Maryland, to protest for improved treatment and care. At that point, there were drugs that were being developed to help AIDS patients, and they weren't available on the U.S. market, and they weren't available to people experimentally or otherwise. And so you would actually, I think this, there was a movie, about one of the guys involved, here, in a lot of this, where I believe they were going to Canada to get drugs and bring them in, I think illegally, so that people would have access to life-saving drugs in the U.S. because the U.S. FDA wasn't allowing access to those drugs, and so it fundamentally changed FDA's approach, to managing drug access. I would argue it didn't move the needle far enough, in terms of access. I would like to see actually more broad availability of drugs, even experimentally, to physicians with appropriate consent to patients. But I also see that on the flip side, we end up putting labeling for drugs, in terms of what indications they can be used for, what they can treat, which I consider to be sometimes bogus. And the drug companies would argue they'd done studies and they showed some defined benefit. But like for instance, there's one drug a doctor had been trying to convince me to take, and when I go and I look at the studies, the control group, so the group where nothing is done, 3 out of 10 of those people get better without any intervention. Okay, and in the treatment group, 4 out of 10 people get better. So the improvement is a 10% improvement on a population level, right? Because 3 out of 10 of those people were getting better without any intervention. You've seen an improvement of in 1 out of 10 of those subjects with the drug. But you also see some really scary and sometimes fatal side effects. You have this interesting situation where I would argue we don't put enough drugs in the hands of physicians to use um, with appropriate safeguards in terms of patient consent, etc. But at the same time, we then approve the drugs that are on the market again for those big existing players, similar to something we talked about earlier about the incentive structures benefiting current companies and current supplier relationships, etc. Um, we're expanding the indications for what existing drugs can be marketed to do, what they can treat. And that's I don't know, it's very interesting if you start going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Um, I think I've exhausted all of my questions that I can think of. I think you've covered pretty much everything that I could have imagined getting to. So it's just like a short recap, and then you can maybe correct me on anything or fill in any important points that you think I missed. But
Absolutely.
so it seems like today people are very tribal, and that seems to extend into the institutions, which are tribal, or what we'd call probably political, right? Being political instead of seeking truth, seeking position, power, advantage of some sort. And
And
so,
the agencies themselves accrue power to
right.
themselves as opposed to serving the interests of the constituents that they're tasked with serving, or the people that they're supposed to help. So
And so
that
be,
there's that power dynamic as well. Yeah.
and because of that, they do things that are either deceitful or untruthful or not in the best interest of their constituents, and therefore they lose trust, and which polarizes people even more because some groups see conspiracies everywhere, and other groups who agree with the political decisions are like, well, they've got my interests at least, so I'm all on board. And what we end up seeing is that maybe there's not one overarching big huge conspiracy uh, Illuminati type conspiracy thing, but when interests converge and you get these systems that can be manipulated, or systems that by happenstance have kind of landed the way that they are and advantage the people that they advantage, those things get solidified, and you get this cyclical revolving door effect, um, which just perpetuates and exacerbates, and maybe uh, you know grows the problem over time.
And I would just add, it's oftentimes not out of a nefarious intention, right? But there's a willful blindness to those things that aren't in service of my interests, right? And I think to some extent that's human, but we see it permeating our institutions at the moment, where people are willfully blind to counterfactuals that don't suit their particular narrative. um, and that's a very easy thing to fall into as a human being, because we don't see reality as it is. I mean, even our visual system is we were talking about or you were talking about detective work, right? I mean, that it's notorious how faulty human vision is in terms of seeing things that aren't there, or not seeing things that are right in front of you. And so we do the same things in our minds in terms of the positions that we hold. and maybe the reasons we should reconsider holding those positions in the first place.
Yeah, there are all kinds of mental illusions and things that go on. So confirmation bias is something that happens a lot. But then I don't know if you're familiar with change blindness, but where you kind of just see what's normal and you don't notice the change even when it's drastic. I don't know if you've ever seen that the basketball one, where they're all
Yes, I
dribbling.
love that.
Okay.
I love that with
Yeah.
the guy in the gorilla suit or something.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, nobody ever gets it. I didn't get it, and it's astounding that you can miss something so obvious.
And the things that are right under your nose, you tend to start ignoring as well. And that's one of the things that so like right now I've got a lot of clutter in front of me on the desk, but my brain spends a certain amount of energy just ignoring it, right? Whereas if I'd actually gone and cleaned it up, spent some real energy doing that, my brain wouldn't have to constantly spend cycles ignoring the clutter. um so
Right,
it's
and
it's yeah.
it's amazing. Like, our house will be cluttered. We are not super disorganized, but we just we have different priorities, I guess. And I don't notice the clutter until it's like, hey, we've got company coming over today. When did the house become such a mess? It's like that trigger of, oh, we have company coming over today, helps me to see things that I didn't see just a
Yeah.
minute ago.
And that's fundamentally one of the challenges with bureaucracy, right? So one, the clutter accumulates, but two, we've gotten used to ignoring a lot of what's there. So we don't even see, or people within the bureaucratic state don't see the impact that that clutter has on everybody around them, or on the, sort of on how things would otherwise operate if they cleaned it up a little bit. And there's also this situation where there's not a lot of reinvention, right? It's like this is what we've been doing. We've been doing it for a long time, and you don't necessarily recognize the reasons that people started doing that thing in the first place. And the situation on the ground may have changed such that it doesn't make sense to be doing that anymore. So, one for instance there that I'll leave you with is, FDA started as a small number of people, and basically, I believe it was called the Poison Squad. This is back, late 1800s, early 1900s. These folks were tasting, like trying out different commercial like foods and seeing if they got sick. And if they did, they'd do some further investigation, right? And at that point, with a group that small, it made sense that you had to bring everything to you. But anymore, the size and scale of what we're doing at an institution like FDA, there are so many people there, they could actually go out and visit all of the facilities directly. They wouldn't have to bring everything to them. And so fundamentally, when you hit certain scales, the way that you should operate in being most efficient and most effective might change. And I would argue that we've gotten to that kind of a situation right now with a lot of our institutions, where they continue to do the things the way they've always done, but the reasons they used to do those things in the manner that they did them, it's no longer the situation. And we should be rethinking how we go about doing business at some of these federal agencies, because they can be a lot more effective if they go out instead of bring everything to them.
All right. Well, I told Catalina midnight, and it's right about that. It's a little bit
It's
after.
right
So,
about that time.
so
Well, thank
you
you
so
for
much.
your patience, and in we always tend to go long, but I'm glad you put up with my long-winded conversational stuff.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, yep.
Now you've got to send it to the editors. It'll be like a 10-minute edited clip. You can take out all the extra bits and pieces.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm the editor. So
so not so much. Publish it in its full unadult, unedited form.
Most of the time I do very, very little editing. I'll have to do a little bit more on this one just because of the breaks and
because of the break.
things. But yeah, I've got a list of questions, but with this one, it was more of just chatting and seeing where it went. So,
well, hopefully we covered all the bases, and if we didn't, I'm sure we can chat again soon.
All right, sounds good.
Well, thank you very much. I hope it was useful and helpful for your audience. And I inquire, about negative feedback from people, or I solicit it and welcome it. So if anybody has some ideas about where I'm horribly wrong in any particular, I would love to hear it. So please do send Derek your negative feedback so that I can get it.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.